My name is Matt Stemick. Thanks for coming, guys. Thank you for watching the live stream or listening or watching a recording. My talk is titled Socialism and Finance, the Reins of Capital. Basically, I'm going to be talking about the structural economic forces that shape class struggle and socialist transformation, and some of the impediments that different movements have had over the years with implementing social democratic and socialist transformation, as well as some ideas of how to confront or overcome those impediments. So the fundamental thesis of what we're talking about, I think, can be summed up thusly. While class struggle is political, the struggle's terrain and constraints are shaped by political economy. The features of political economy can be manipulated by the state and powerful capitalist institutions, including but not limited to the finance industry. Makes sense. Okay, so starting off, so social democracy, we all know it, we all love it. It's great. You get healthcare, you get taxing the rich, you get social services, infrastructure, public transportation, whatever you want. But I think, as everyone here, I'm assuming most listeners know, it has had a rocky road, and there's been a bit of retreat from social democracy in the neoliberal era. So, as famous English socialist Ralph Miliband said, social democratic leaders in office have always endorsed conservative economic policies and submitted equally readily to the constraints this has imposed upon them. And there's a useful concept, known as the Kalecki points. Kalecki's some economist, wrote a famous paper, The Political Aspects of for Employment, something like that, where essentially he talks about the moment in social democratic advancement where welfare capitalism, basically a euphemism for social democracy, viability has been fatally undermined. As unions, low unemployment, and safety social nets proliferate, workers question not only the employer's profits, but the underlying property relations that drive capitalism in the first place. And then once you get to this Kalecki points, there, in theory, must be either a jump forward, some kind of breaking point, or more likely and more historically, a retreat of social democracy as capitalist interests are able to push back on workers' movements. So, why does this happen? Are social democratic leaders just cowards? Do they get cold feet? Are they betraying their base? I would like to attempt to take a more structural view of this social democratic retreat so that we can have a theory of how to overcome the forces that cause it, instead of just blaming particular individuals. So we're going to talk through different capitalist methods that either the state or capitalist capitalist structures employ, as well as the two in confluence. So we're going to run through some of them. So the first one I want to talk about are capital strikes. Capital strikes take the form of layoffs, offshoring of jobs, denying loans, and threats to do any of the above. Potential demands of capitalist strikes may be pro-corporate trade deals, cutting corporate taxes, and scrapping regulations. So a great example here is when Obama was elected and took office in 2009, obviously everyone knows, following the Great Recession, financial crash. So in 2009, non-financial businesses sat on $2 trillion in capital, while banks kept another $1 trillion. So there's a glut of capital. It's not like they don't have anything to invest. However, they decided to sustain their divestments, and this gave them massive leverage over the legislative process and the recovery that Obama's administration was implementing. The Obama administration ruled out any legislative option that would either, force banks to absorb their losses or place them under temporary government control. And they were very, very cautious of even using any language in that direction for fear of scaring off capitalist investment, basically. This is a quote by the CEO of Financial Services Forum, Rob Nichols, during the negotiations with the government. There's a trade-off with higher capital ratios, and that is the impact on lending and economic growth. So capital ratios, I'm not going to get into it too much, but it's basically what banks have to keep in reserve, the ratio they have to keep in reserve compared to how much they lend out. So if it's very low, that means they can lend more. If it's high, they have to keep more in the bank, basically. However, studies have shown that capital reserves do not have an immediate impact on the ability of banks to lend, or at the very least, a small one. And these are smart bankers, they have some of the best economists in the world, they know this. So that can only be interpreted as a threat. That's not an automatic market mechanism. That's saying, if you regulate us harder, we're not going to invest. So that's the section on capital strikes. Next, we're going to go to a similar concept, maybe a different application of the same concept, municipal shakedowns. So I'm going to start with an example with our buddy over here, our great, wet president, Mr. Trump. In the 1970s, the U.S. experienced a very austere investment environment. There was inflation, just a lot of capital fear in terms of the private investments. During this time, Donald Trump used a hotel project in Manhattan to extract millions in tax breaks from New York City. He was granted a 40-year waiver on all real estate taxes for his Grand Hyatt Hotel on 42nd Street in return for his investment. So basically, no one was investing in real estate, and he used that leverage, that opportunity, to just get massive tax breaks in return for, a relatively paltry investment, much of which I wonder how much came out of his own pockets anyway, but regardless, that gets to the point. A more modern example is Mr. Bezos himself and the much publicized Amazon Sweepstakes. So Amazon basically turned their bid for their second headquarters, or HQ2, into like a game show, a contest. They released big publicized press announcements and did a lot of, public whatever, like things through the press. So it was basically a big game show. There were 238 bids for Amazon's headquarters. Here are some examples of things cities offered. The city of Newark offered up to $7 billion in incentives. Stonecrest, Georgia offered to split up a piece of their land and create the city of Amazon, Georgia, with Jeff Bezos being the permanent mayor for life. Not a joke, literally happened. The Maryland governor basically said that this is actually a real quote, for all practical purposes, it's a blank check in terms of tax breaks, in terms of them spending on infrastructure for the sake of Amazon, et cetera, et cetera. So when these shakedowns happen, it's not a one-time loss for the public coffers, just in terms of tax breaks. So for instance, GE relocated their headquarters to Boston. And when they relocate, they obviously bring a lot of their executives, a lot of their high-level employees, these are highly paid people. And so they exacerbated an already struggling affordable housing market. They put more stress on public infrastructure and things like that. And when these companies relocate and they get all these tax breaks, they're not paying for the developments that is required of public services to accommodate their new business and their new gentrification lifestyle. Property prices go up. So the city continuously takes these losses from the public coffers, while the company got the tax breaks and the other incentives. And so despite all that, the main factor for a company like Amazon is actually not taxes in the first place. What they need is a suitable labor force. That's why you see somewhere like Silicon Valley emerge, is because there's a concentration of skilled workers in that area where companies can poach one another. They have graduate schools and a high concentration of educated labor force. So that's basically the main factor that Amazon would need. So these municipalities and states are just giving away tax incentives and just a ton of revenue, despite the fact that it probably will have negligible to no influence on Amazon's decision anyway. Okay, so that's that. Here is an interesting example that shows how scared people resisting these shakedowns that both local governments and industry are. There was a case, I should have put the year, but it's Daimler Chrysler Corp v. Kuno. This was in Ohio. The Chrysler Corporation wanted to relocate a Jeep plant, and the citizens of the city they were going to relocate in, the taxpayers, they sued their local government, I think their state government, over the tax incentives, saying that, we don't want this, this affects our lives, whatever. And you can't just give away these tax incentives to this corporation, all these tax cuts. When this case was brought to the Supreme Court, two corporate coalitions formed on K Street being the major think tank and lobbying street in Washington, D.C., to file amicus briefs against the plaintiffs. If you don't know, amicus briefs are basically briefs or pieces of information that an outside party gives to the courts in order to bring what they believe is relevant information to a particular case. 37 states, almost every association of state and local elected officials, and many company and trade associations also filed amicus briefs against the plaintiffs. So this just shows how incredibly, I don't know if scared is the right word, but incredibly opposed to citizens having a say in these tax breaks that companies as well as local governments are. So this shows how undemocratic this is. Okay, so that's it for municipal shakedowns. Here's some possible solutions proposed to issues like this. Capital controls make it hard for capital strikes or capital flight to happen. It makes it more expensive to offshore money. Financial transaction tax would generate income from the financial sector where capital is hiding. That in theory could spur more investments instead of just putting more money into complex financial transactions. And it would shrink the financial sector as well, which in theory could grow other more productive sectors. Federal regulation against states or cities competing with each other over private investments. There's no reason that can't happen. It's just a matter of electing a Congress who would want that to happen. So that's kind of an issue, but regardless. And then socialized finance is kind of a more long-term goal, and we're going to talk about that later. Okay, so now on to our section on finance. Dun, dun, dun. Okay, so I want to talk about monetary policy for a bit. I know it's a very, very sexy subject. People love this stuff. Who doesn't love some good monetary policy? So the thesis of this part is that policymakers have used subterranean tactics to wage a class war, changing the constraints that workers, their organizations, and firms confronted on seemingly apolitical capitalist markets. Murray Weidenbaum, who was Reagan's chair of the Council of Economic Advisors, said, bless you, "We are not telling labor and management what to do. We are subjecting them to the fundamental forces of market pressures." Basically, the idea is they're not going to force management or labor one direction or another, although they did have some things like that. They're not even recommending management or labor take one particular action. They're trying to change the terrain of class relations through monetary policy, such that the class relations must fit a worldview and the economic interests of finance, the government, capitalist class in general. So throughout the 1970s and early 80s, USA experienced inflation rates as high as 14%. So it's a major crisis. So it's one of the biggest political issues of the day. The Reagan administration believed it had to weaken labor's ability to make wage gains and also discipline firms they viewed as too generous in negotiations. To do this, they used the monetary policy of the Federal Reserve. This guy, is anyone familiar with the big dog, Paul Volcker himself, the Volcker shock, eponymous? If anyone's listening, it's Paul Volcker smoking a cigar in like a congressional hearing or something. So Chairman of the Fed, Paul Volcker, believed that high expectations of America's workforce must be crushed to stabilize its currency. He believed that the USA had a moral obligation to the world to stabilize its currency, lowering the volatility in markets. So a stable U.S. economy, a stable U.S. currency kind of underpins the confidence in international trade. So he thought that to stabilize international markets, the U.S. had an obligation to stabilize its currency by any means necessary. So inflation taxes capital stock, bankrupts the thrift industry, like saving, capital, like saved up money or other capital, undermines government securities, weakens American firms via their foreign trading partners, and hinders foreign investment. So a cost-push theory of inflation posits that labor power is a major driver of inflation. This is the theory that he was working off of. A 1970 OECD report urged governments to shift from the goal of full employment, as many European, Australian governments were doing at the time. This was a Keynesian goal. In theory, was full unemployment. The U.S. less so, but still had pretty low unemployment, and was definitely a major policy goal. And instead, to use fiscal and monetary policy to raise unemployment rates. So it's explicitly demarcated in an OECD report. So as interest rates went up, by Paul Volcker's doing, it made borrowing to finance investment or consumption.
Just to pause for a minute. So that's a typo, right?
Probably.
It says raise employment rates. You mean raise unemployment rates?
Yes.
Okay.
Sorry.
No problem.
I did this at like 3 a.m.
No problem.
Thanks for pointing that out. As interest rates went up, it made borrowing to finance investment or consumption more expensive. As these costs went up, firms were pushed to be more austere. This would lower consumer demand and slow the economy as a whole, intentionally putting the economy into a recession. In 1981, after a severe tightening of the money supply, unemployment rose to 11%. I think it's at like 4% today. So this is over twice as much as we have today. It's pretty bad. So this put dual pressure, a two-sided pressure on labor unions who were still riding their high point from the post-war period. So one, there's a glut of desperate unemployed workers looking for work, scabs, undermining union power to control the workplace. And two, employers were squeezed by high interest rates. It was very difficult to keep up, labor costs, to invest in new capital for new productive work, and so they're almost forced to try to break unions or undermine them in any way. Not that they wouldn't want to do that anyway, but it provides extra incentive, if not, need to do so. Industries like agriculture and manufacturing wanted Volcker's head, but he was still a darling of Wall Street, and Reagan kept him in regardless. I have some charts here. I guess this is going to be an audio, so I'll try to point out what some of them are saying. So this is a little much. We're going to start here. U.S. inflation rates up from 1960 to 2010. So as you can see, there's some pretty major spikes in the 70s and early 80s. Right? Around 81, 82, it starts to drop pretty precipitously with the Volcker shock. Volcker shock is what the tightening of money supply was termed Volcker shock. Here we have U.S. union density from 1930 to 2000. As you can see, we had a high in the era between the 1950s, at which point it starts decreasing. International markets get more competitive. Europe and Japan and whatever start building industries up a bit. But if you can see in late 1970s, early 80s, there's a pretty shocking drop. And we've never recovered since. It's been on a downslope in the meantime. And finally, we have, I guess this is cut off a little bit, but productivity versus average real earnings of workers. So basically, this is how much is being produced in the private sector versus how much workers are being paid in purchasing power, accounting for inflation. So as you can see, they pretty much rise together until about 1975, where they start to split off. And then in the early to mid 80s, there's a complete cleavage between productivity and wages. So what that's telling you is that more is going to profit, basically, which makes sense. Union density is going down, workers are less empowered, they're able to make less demands on their employers, profitability skyrockets, shareholder value skyrockets, And we've been living in that world ever since, and it seems to only be getting worse. And so here's some of the effects of Volcker's policy, Volcker and Reagan's and whoever else. Manufacturing in former industrial centers like the Rust Belt still have not recovered. American firms were able to revive the profit rate for American capital. As we kind of saw in the last chart, their productivity is going up, but labor's wages are stagnant, so that money is going somewhere to profit. Firms intensified work, means exploitation, through speed and reorganization while turning to financial speculation instead of capital investment to drive profits. Finance capital gained the most from the Fed's policies. Wall Street and other financial institutions have more power and more profit than ever. And just randomly, I wanted to point out, Paul was appointed by Jimmy Carter originally. Okay. He was a Democrat. Paul Volcker himself was a Democrat, and also Volcker helped Obama in his recovery policy after the 2008 crash. So I don't want to be like just saying it's all Reagan's fault or Nixon or whatever. Okay, so that's it on monetary. Everyone knows the other nice bald boy, Milton Friedman. The Friedman Doctrine states that there is one and only one social responsibility of business, and that is to use its resources and engage in activities designed to increase its profits. So this was not necessarily taken for granted until Milton really hit the scene. There was some expectation that business had obligations to the community, to its workers, different shareholders, etc. Whether that was ever truly the case, arguable, but at least that was nominally true, or at least arguable. But Milton said, no, none of that. The only moral obligation business has is to increase shareholder profit. And that is the optimal moral system, and otherwise you get totalitarianism. So that leads to stockholder primacy. So employers in the neoliberal era have become addicted to funneling gains from labor productivity to shareholders. Goldman Sachs recently reported that they predict that every percentage point increase in labor cost inflation will drag down earnings of companies in the S&P by 0.8%. So this is a pretty recent idea that's being put out in the financial media, which is that we actually are in a pretty short labor market right now. So in theory, that does benefit laborers. Unemployment's very low, and there's actual labor shortage going on right now. And so all these financial firms are kind of freaking out, and they're saying, oh, what if labor gets paid? Like, God forbid, right? And they're just all these doomsday ideas about if employers have to start offering better wages, because they basically haven't done that for 40 years. In 2017, American Airlines announced a healthy wage increase. Within 48 hours, 2 trading periods, they lost $1.9 billion in market value, for more than 8% of their market value. So even when a company tries to give scraps to their workers and employees, they're punished by finance. They're beat down. Here we could see corporate profits as a share of gross domestic income versus labor's share of gross domestic income. You can see a general trend on corporate profits increasing. There's some dips in times of crisis, as capitalism is wont to do. But labor share, on the other hand, since the 90s, has been just precipitously falling. So from, I think it's like 1990 to 2016, we go from under 3.5% to around 6.5% of share of income as corporate profit, whereas labor is the opposite. So we get a doubling on one side and a halving on the other side, basically. So this is kind of a random title, but I titled this Pension Judo, and you'll see why soon. Basically, the idea, I'm thinking of like some Karate Kid thing where, a fighter uses their own opponent's power against them, kind of thing. So pension funds are ground zero for financial democracy for 3 major reasons. Workers' retirement funds have accumulated a huge financial fortune since their emergence in the 1950s. They began as union collectively bargaining contracts and have since moved to 401k type plans. Pension funds are a critical source of finance capital for American firms. While originally they were tied to low-risk bonds, they've moved to equity market investments. So this ties workers' own retirement interests to the market itself. And workers and unions have had a difficult time controlling their funds. Professional fiduciaries employed by banks, hedge funds, other financial institutions are under the direction of employer-dominated trustee boards. So the Taft-Hartley Act of 1947 made it illegal, made it illegal for unions to control more than 50% of the trustee seats on pension boards. And these are, worker pensions. So basically the idea here is that unions cannot have sole control over, their own workers' pension funds, allocating those funds where they want. And this was a very explicit anti-worker, anti-union legislation idea here that did not want unions to have too much power. There's a justification. I should have said who said this, but it was the congressman. Quote, unless we impose some restrictions, we shall find that the welfare fund will become merely a war chest for the particular union. God forbid, right? Another piece of legislation, the 1974 Employment, Retirement, and Income Security Act included a provision known as the Prudent Man Rule. This rule basically says that pension investments should be made for the exclusive benefit of plan beneficiaries. So this is very similar and maybe even the same as the Friedman Doctrine, right? This is saying, Bean, I control your pension. So I'm not going to put this to anything that can help anyone else. I'm not going to put it to any social, any strategic for unions, funding, nothing. I'm going to get you as much money as I possibly can for you as an individual. So plans before this act could be invested in union projects, worker housing, investment for new jobs in the community, et cetera, different social causes. After, plans legally had to serve participants instead of allocating to any kind of social fund. Fiduciaries then invest in riskier equity portfolios for bigger returns. Securities, stocks have generally a bigger theoretical return than bonds or other secure investments. So if it's my job, and the law says it's my job to make you as much money as possible, I'm going to invest in stocks. So now that these funds were controlled by capitalist institutions, they could be leveraged to create a more business-friendly environment. Investing in companies that have worse labor practices, offshoring, et cetera, different things that drive capitalist profit. And so the workers' retirement funds themselves can be redirected towards capitalist profit. Obviously, as a collective picture, driving the exploitation of workers themselves. Hence, pension judo. Okay, so now I want to talk about financialization. I like this picture a lot. Anyone can't see it. Someone's hands tied with a big $100 bill beside it. This part might not have a lot of continuity, so I apologize beforehand, but maybe it does. Anyway, so before we get into any particular thing, let's get a rundown of some Marxist concepts. So capital is private property used to form profit in terms of surplus value. Surplus value is value derived from other people's laborers. You have a capitalist, and they get value off their workers' labor. Surplus value is monetized in commodity exchange via a price system in a market. You have your workers produce something, you pay them, but then you take the commodity they produce, you sell it for a higher price. Whatever is the difference there is the surplus value in terms of Marxist theory. So money cannot be converted into capital if wage labor does not exist. There's a primacy of labor, and that is the relationship that allows for markets, capitalist accumulation to occur. If money capital increases by an interest rate over a period, interest is one of the primary mechanisms of credit in finance. That's because productive capitalists were able to produce sufficient surplus value within that time period of which interest had to be paid. Okay, so now let's talk about finance as social control, or cash rules everything around it. Get it? Right. finance, cash, and rules, us. So here we get the title of my talk, Finance, the Reins of Capital. So going back a very long time, corporations were not necessarily as we conceive of them now. They were originally defined as a body of people with some sort of hierarchy and defined roles, engaging in some productive process. Commodity production and the profit motive do not necessarily constitute a corporation. And I believe that even Miami DSA is a corporation. We are a nonprofit corporation, correct? So there's no inherent structure that says a corporation has to only pursue profit making, right? So thinkers like Keynes and Galbraith saw a possible evolution of a corporation into some kind of planning or collective organization of production. So there's a question, why has nothing like this happened? Corporations are still only interested in commodity production, in surplus value, in markets, et cetera, et cetera. I was actually thinking of, I don't know if anyone saw, there was the Pizza Hut guys like filling in potholes on the roads, that thing was Domino's, which is obviously a PR stunt. They're not doing a real public service. They're just doing a commercial about it. But in theory, there's nothing stopping a group of people with capital from doing something like that. Not to get too like ANCAP. So we know the Friedman Doctrine from earlier. So it is the role of shareholders and their advocates, as well as institutions like private equity, to ensure that corporations remain within capitalist logic. David Harvey refers to the credit system as a kind of central nervous system through which the overall circulation of capital is coordinated. Basically, finance, the various levers of finance are what are pushing and pulling various business entities into organization, into organizing production in service of maximized profit. As the financial sector has experienced explosive growth, since I guess the 80s really, the growth in the amount of actual financial intermediation activity in the economy has failed to keep up. So basically that means that the amount of wealth or profit being generated on a per unit basis next to the size of the finance industry itself is not keeping up with the growth of the finance industry. Finance is becoming less efficient as it grows, which kind of doesn't make sense in terms of capitalist logic. You would think that there's marginal utility, that the finance industry itself would start to slow down as its efficiency is lowering in terms of profit making. This doesn't necessarily happen. So the question is why? And there are a few theories as to why. So, does everyone here know what index funds are? Roughly, ETF, all that. Basically, they're very broad. I think they're this kind of like mutual funds, but extremely broad throughout the entire market. So, for instance, I believe the S&P 500 is an index fund. So basically, you have a share. When you invest in one of these funds, you have a share in the 500 companies that are in the S&P 500, some of the biggest companies in America. And so it's a very diffuse mechanism for ownership of common stock companies.
Vanguard is the big company.
Yeah, Vanguard invented the index fund basically, and it kind of revolutionized finance. Before, people would this stock looks good. Oh, this industry's on an upswing, and people still do that somewhat. But Vanguard kind of realized that the only sure way to make money in the long term is just invest in the market as a whole, or broad swaths of the market. And so that's what an index fund is. So because they share common shareholders, capitalist logic kind of changes from one firm competing with another to preferring a stable market. So the entire logic of capitalism is that, and private ownership of property, companies, capital, etc., is that you have these different interests competing with one another, driving innovation, pushing costs down, driving efficiency, because these different entities that own companies want to, go at it and want to take each other's profit, and in doing so, the survival of the fittest wins. But we don't necessarily have that anymore because we have extremely diffuse ownership. Everyone's invested in these mutual and index funds, from my parents to like GE, some of the biggest corporations in the world. So there is like common ownership throughout broad swaths of the market. So financial consolidation helps create a sort of artificial competition if certain metrics aren't being met by a particular firm. So management can be removed, or the company can be stripped for its parts if they're not turning a profit. And that's because of the consolidation of financial management in terms of banks and Wall Street, etc., is that they kind of get to create their own version of competition if the market is not necessarily providing that themselves. We're saying, we're going to loan you this money. If you're not profitable, we're going to just destroy you. We're going to get rid of your management, etc., etc. And so, bless you, the financial institutions are able to create pressures on individual firms, even if the market itself maybe is not incentivized to do that. Was that your explanation? Does that make sense? So financialization. So yeah, this is a little bit schizophrenic. It's kind of jumping all over the place, but I hope like the broad thesis makes sense. In the end, I'm trying to just explain like finance in its current state as I understand it. So balanced capital accumulation is impossible without lots of credit on hand. There's too many discontinuities within market structures, temporally and physically. So what I mean by that is, if I invest in a bunch of widgets, I invest in capital to create a bunch of widgets, I create a surplus. Maybe after I make those widgets, I have a big inventory. There might not be demand to meet the surplus of inventory that I have at a particular time period. I may have missed the demand, or the demand may be just impossible to forecast. So credit allows me to kind of wait out that discontinuity between supply and demand. It allows me to buy time, to leverage more in the future, and it acts as a smoothing agent, essentially allowing firms to hedge their bets in terms of all kinds of market factors. Without credit, capitalist markets would not really be able to achieve any kind of stability in terms of accumulation. Yeah, so that's basically like this. So fictitious capital, stocks and bonds, things you have to pay back, interest, etc., always depends on the fruits of future labor. Assuming economic conditions are suitable to sustain a meaningful link in credit and labor value, we're all good. So basically that means that, Will, I'm going to loan you money, right? Because you told me you're going to go start a mango juice stand, right? And so if you start a mango juice stand, and the amount of labor value that you're able to put into the economy, as well as like meeting demand, is roughly equivalent to what we both expected, then we're all good. You'll be able to pay me back in the future. We'll have some kind of equity, some kind of stability between ourselves. If you were not able to do that, or if you just didn't do anything, you did not create value through labor, then suddenly our monetary or our money system, including fictitious money, loans, stocks, etc., becomes detached from actual productive forces in society. So as credit becomes more integral to the economy in terms of consumer credit cards, student loans, subprime mortgage, securitization, etc., the gap between fictitious value and money tied to real labor value widens. So credit not only permits traditional money to be extended, generalized, spatially and temporally, but it actually exacerbates that effect when it comes to the crisis tendencies of capitalism that we're also familiar with as socialists. Basically, the stakes get higher when capitalism eats itself every once in a while. So economist Cedric Durand, I hope I'm pronouncing it right, I don't know, defines financialization as a form of capitalism distinguished by the accumulation of drawing rights over values that are yet to be produced. I think he even refers to it as like the dying breath of capitalism, basically, where the major monetary yields are being made on labor yet to be done. Hypothetical labor that may or may not be productive, may or may not, have good market, returns, et cetera, et cetera. And regarding the state's role in 2008, he says that, whoever knows 2008, the bank bailouts, all that stuff, we talked about it briefly earlier. He says, the hegemony of finance, the most fetishized form of wealth, is only maintained through the public authority's unconditional support. Left to itself, fictitious capital would collapse. And yet, that would also pull down the whole of our economies in its wake. In truth, finance is a master blackmailer. Financial hegemony dresses up in the liberal trappings of the market. It captures the old sovereignty of the state. All the better to squeeze the social body to feed its own profits. Is this still capitalism? So the point he's making there is that we are all dependent on finance to drive economic investment in terms of real economic production. Without finance in our current economic state, everything would collapse, investment would slow to a halt, and just economic activity would be, just completely undermined, and it would be a disaster. However, they don't really operate according to market logic because they're not necessarily on a market because they have the full backing of the state, the sovereignty of the people. So the point he's making is that it's kind of like a melding of, state sovereignty in terms of, say, feudalism or something, with, market mechanisms and the profit motive, and surplus value, and all those good Marxist themes, to create, really just an unimpeachable force within society that really just has us all, with a gun to our heads. That if they fail, we all fail, and therefore they can't fail. Too big to fail is the old conceit, whatever. But this does have some interesting implications in terms of our theoretical understanding of finance as socialist and strategy going forward. So this is all kind of a lot of, finance is not the most fun thing. I didn't have a lot of pictures, did these sections, and it was kind of all over the place, although I hope it's building to something. So I decided to put a quick puppy break, decompress. Also, that last part was kind of dark, being blackmailed by financiers who have the backing of the state, etc. So, let's just take a breath, watch the puppies. Like that one, thinks he's swimming.
Look at that one with the cat, he's kind of babysitting.
Oh, yeah, that's my fetish. Okay, I think we're good on puppies. Okay, so now we go towards a socialist theory of finance, something that we have to develop as materialists, as people who want to understand the world as it is and build that into something new. We can't just disregard finance, but we can't necessarily subscribe to, bourgeois economic theories of finance either. We have to understand state theory, we have to understand class relations, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm going to start trying to build into that using whatever knowledge I've been able to accumulate. So, talk about finance and dialectics.
I was wondering before going to the socialist part, the idea, the one you just presented, why is it an issue on claims on the future value? Finance has always been essentially a claim on future value. I understand. The idea of financialization is just it's increased to a super big extent. But if the idea, why is it it's an issue when there's some sort of thing that the housing crisis, it's the underwriting wasn't good, and so therefore everything collapsed, and the underwriting was reliable. But let's say that this is one example. Have you heard of a Vantage score?
No.
So FICO.
Sorry, I'm just gonna say I'm not an expert. I'm just doing my best. But yeah, keep going.
Okay. So
I'll try to answer.
The two major credit bureaus created like a joint venture that's basically creating like new underwriting models for like credit for consumers. And basically, it's kind of like based in big data. It's like okay, not paying medical debt is not an indicator of you not paying your student loan debt or your credit card debt. All these different variables, and it's supposed to be a lot better. So, you used to not be able to. If you didn't pay your student loan 5 years ago, we're not going to give you credit. But now those models are like, okay, according to the historical data, that's not a good predictor. So now we can give you more credit.
Okay.
So in the sense of like, if underwriting doesn't fall apart for various reasons, then what's the why does Duran have that view of like the claim on future value?
Which particular line? Financialization is distinguished by the accumulation of drawing rights over values yet to be produced. So you're saying?
If you go to the one figures.
You say
Again, to the fictitious values and money types real life, the labor value widens.
Okay. So you're saying if that financial institutions could better predict future values, then why is this an issue?
I'm not saying it's good. What I'm saying is that, according to Duran, why is it like worse than past financialization?
I have an answer to that. Like, basically, increased financialization creates like its own incentive structure, and so that the incentive structure becomes instead of figuring out like how to increase actual production and the underlying value, the incentive structure becomes to figure out how to create increasingly like complex, deregulated financial products that that feed on themselves, and people, and like, so the people that are like worrying about all this stuff are focused on that rather than focused on the underlying production. So like that's what happened with the housing crisis. That's if you watch what instead of going like, oh, are these people paying their mortgages? Like what those guys were worried about is like, oh, how can we like flip this tranche into a like and base this other tranche off of it, and I think that's why more financialization because it feeds on itself.
Well, to my point, like, yeah, it was like I think in like June of '07, like the first way that it started like collapsing was when this one big French bank put out a note saying like, oh, sorry, our models were wrong, and this CDO has way more subprime mortgages than we disclosed.
Right.
In that case, it was an issue of underwriting, not so much of like incentives for the products.
Yeah. So, unless you know.
No, keep going.
Okay. So, I mean, I guess that is one particular issue. Although I guess what Bean was saying is that being able to have more complex financial products, derivatives based on futures and like future bets on different products, like you're like doing these like bizarre magnification manipulations that can pile up. I don't know if I have like a perfect answer.
I just think it's a function of like where people's attention is focused.
Not as big a crowd today, huh?
Yeah.
So I mean, I guess underwriting and like better predictive models could help with that. But there still are certain issues, like for one, what Duran mentions about the sovereignty of finance, essentially that they derive power from the state, and they're not subject to market mechanisms. They can't lose. Essentially, so that obviously creates perverse incentives to make riskier and riskier bets, as well as the fact that, and you can see this with an earlier slide I had, I think kind of points to this as well, is that the Trump tax cuts and everything went to corporations, but you don't really see an increase in capital investments that you might expect, or in like worker wage increases. which in theory could drive actual economic growth that could benefit capitalists in the long run, regardless. But what you're seeing that put to is stock buybacks, essentially to inflate their stock prices, to please their shareholders. I forgot where I was going with this. But basically, so even like with what am I saying? Is that financial packages don't necessarily go into economic growth that could be built through like kind of collective action problems. Like so worker pay is a collective action problem from the point of like employers. So if everyone got paid more, that would increase real demand. The economy would cycle more and it would grow. Then there's public infrastructure, which I'm going to get into in a little bit, saying like roads or internet. Is that if there was finance and credit going to those sorts of services and public goods, and that also help capitalists in the long run and help business be able to grow. But their narrow interests prevent them from doing so because it's not a short-term profitable or like underwritten investment. Like so, for instance, you see this around the world. I was literally just in Europe, and it's the same thing here. That everywhere I went, people were saying, "Oh my God, rents are spiking! Like it's crazy! Like it's so expensive to live here." Like every major city like that I've been to, like everywhere I'm moving to Pittsburgh, people are saying that. We're having a rent crisis here in Miami that DSA is involved with. So investing in real estate is a pretty good financial risk. It's you're talking about underwriting. Because there is actual physical real estate, there's collateral, and it's just generally safe investments in general. And so that's where you see a lot of these like capital gluts going to as opposed to other productive sectors of society. So kind of rambling, but like I hope that like sort of somewhat was an answer. Yeah, I think it just has to do with incentives and like atomization of interests, mostly. Okay, so yeah, towards a socialist theory of finance. Okay, so Marx and finance. So everyone knows, Marx and dialectical materialism, et cetera. So Marx said, "No social order ever perishes before all the productive forces for which there is room in it have developed. A new, higher relations of production never appear before the material conditions of their existence have matured in the womb of the old society itself. The productive forces developing in the womb of bourgeois society create the material conditions for the solutions of class antagonism." What Marx is saying is that as capitalism develops, as it grows new features and abilities, new forms, is that the type of mechanisms, the type of structures, the type of class relations that you will see developing give a platform for collective evolution of productive forces and class relations through mechanisms of class antagonism and dialectic and whatever. And so I thought this was interesting is that corporations were kind of first appearing in Marx's mid-life, I believe. They're called common stock companies, and he was pretty interested by the idea of common stock company. He said they represent the abolition of capitalist private industry on the basis of the capitalist system itself, and destroys private industry as it expands. So what he's saying is that originally in capitalism you had kind of a symbiosis between management and ownership. You'd have one really rich dude that owns a factory, he employs a bunch of people, and he gets the money that is made by selling commodities on the market. But with corporations, you have this kind of faceless pool of shareholders who technically own the productive rights of the corporation. Or it's kind of like legally, it's kind of weird. It's like the corporation is its own thing, and they have the right to buy stock in the corporation, don't necessarily own the corporation. It's its own entity. Management doesn't own the corporation either. But regardless, you have this kind of ownership of the profits as a collective being. And he was pretty interested by that mechanism. So here's some features of corporations. One, they represent a property relation that separates ownership from management. Two, they're a fictional unity that exists independently of any one individual. So it's saying is, it's like Mitt Romney or Supreme Court. It's just like after the Civil War, I think. Corporations are people. They have to be thought of as their own entities with their own interess. And so they're a fictional concept that does exist outside of any individual's interests or whims, essentially. And it negotiates conflicts on interests according to their fiduciary duties of care, loyalty, and good faith, obviously to their stockholders. So we talked about index funds and kind of the dispersion of ownership in the market. So I thought this was interesting. So it can be argued that index funds represent simultaneously a perfection of financial capitalism and a quasi-communist form of public ownership. Obviously not real public ownership. The more money you have, the more stake you have in an index fund, in particular companies, etc. But there is still this diffuse mechanism where tons of interests basically own all the same stocks and companies. The technical success of index funds undermines a basic capitalist assumption that private ownership is necessary for competition, efficiency, and innovation. This is what I was talking about earlier with financial institutions, private equity, and banks that kind of enforce an artificial competition, enforcing profitability on companies and firms. And so Matt Brunig, I don't know if you guys know or are fans of him, argues that index funds are a kind of proof of concept for market socialism because they show that the benefits of market mechanisms can be organized to operate independently of who owns and profits from corporate activity. So firms are still competing, firms still make profits, despite the fact that the ownership of these large firms, by and whole, are not independent interests. They are, again, diffuse kind of collective interests. That's not stopping profitability in any sense. So the idea is that model can be expanded to a country or a society as a whole to give, public ownership or kind of ownership as a right in different industry, which is, arguably socialism. I mean, I don't want to get into what socialism is, but it's like, in theory, a tenet of socialism, right?
So is that gentleman for, because he mentions there that there are benefits of market mechanisms. So are there benefits of market mechanisms? Because is he for benefits of market mechanisms?
We talked about this last time.
Right.
Price calculation, sort of, figuring out where to allocate what.
Yeah.
I mean, your talk is covering similar territory to mine, but you're better at explaining things than me. So yeah.
Because
But we talked about all of this last week.
Okay.
Yeah.
Did you use these papers by any chance?
I did not use those papers.
Okay, sweet. Sounds good. At least. Are there benefits?
I used Brunig, but I used his papers are like one page. So,
Yeah. So are there benefits to market mechanisms? I personally, that's like contentious in left spaces. A lot of like pretty hardcore socialists would probably say no, and that if there are markets, if there are commodities, if there are prices, that's not socialism because there's still commodity production, there's still itemization of labor, and that productive forces are not being put towards socially beneficial uses, but they're still being used in a market system to diffuse distribution and production. So a lot of socialists would say no. I personally don't understand mechanisms that would replace all of the market mechanisms that currently exist today, like Pete was saying, like price signaling.
But the real question here is, if you took all the index funds that exist today,
Yeah.
the Vanguard, all that other shit,
And
it
give it to everyone.
doesn't really discriminate in terms of who it's like invested in. It just takes very broad swaths of the economy. and you took those shares and you just distributed them all out equally to everyone,
Yeah.
that would be better for society than only having rich people own them.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay.
And the idea being that market mechanisms can still exist within that system,
Exactly.
and it's like in theory kind of proven to this point.
Right. It wouldn't have any perverse incentives as opposed to what we already have, because we
Yeah.
already have these index funds.
Yep.
It's just that the ownership in them is very concentrated.
Pretty much.
I mean, like from a but like that still creates like a labor aristocracy where it creates like an incentive for the American working class to support the American capitalist class, and so it creates a dynamic where it's like, okay, yes, it's all cheer on the advance of like.
Well, right now, a lot of the investment in the funds is pension funds. So it's retirees, that it's retirees that own a lot of that.
Yeah, so
But he's right. Is that
Yeah,
like
yeah.
what I mentioned before? Is that the fact that these pension funds are put into capitalist markets does spur on capitalist development, et cetera, et cetera. But a lot of socialists hate the idea of like market socialism. They don't think it's real. I guess in theory, this kind of makes everyone a capitalist, or it makes society a capitalist. And whether that's a good thing or whether that's possible or whatever is debatable. And you're right, you still have profits and capitalist modes of production, et cetera. You just have to fuse ownership of capital, essentially. So, but I do have some like interesting things coming up, even regarding those points, which we will get into. Good questions, though, for sure. Valid points. So, I would recommend anyone who is interested in this stuff to look at these papers. They're not too long. I think they're about like 30 to 40 pages each with big fonts and some charts and stuff, making it pretty easy. But they're really, really interesting.
I'm going to zoom in real quick. Hold on.
Okay.
I'm not on the way, man.
No, you're good.
Actually, Charles just messaged saying.
Yeah, where is Charles?
Does that work?
Do you mind just back a little?
Am I showing up?
Yeah.
What if I see?
So yeah, I would recommend these two papers. They are Finance Without Financiers by Robert C. Hockett of Cornell Law School. And the second one is Financial Democratization and the Transition to Socialism by Fred Block from the Department of Sociology at University of California, Davis. The second one actually builds off of the first one, so I'd read them in that order. And I'm going to jump into what they have to say right now and hopefully explain them to the best of my abilities. But if people are interested, I would definitely look into that. Wait, what? Oh, wait, what? Hold on. It seems to have cut off. Oh man, that's weird.
No more slides?
I thought I had saved last night. Is there no more slides? Do you have internet? Can I check it from Dropbox? Because that's where I had it from. If not, I guess I'll just talk about it like briefly to my own understanding. Sorry about that. Yeah.
I have, there's Xfinity Wi-Fi. I don't know if you're a Comcast customer.
Doesn't matter.
Well,
I actually got on my phone. I can check it.
yeah, if you have,
I was even
if you
able
have
to,
data, if you have data.
Save this stuff. Oh my god, what? I guess it did not upload to Dropbox, so that's really disappointing. Damn. I guess I can just open, I have like notes on it, and the slides are basically notes. Would that be okay?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay. Yeah, sorry about that. I don't know what happened. Okay. Is this corrupted too? Oh, wait. Yeah, look, can I go for Wi-Fi? Sorry. What'd you say it was?
Well, there's not a I don't have a dedicated Wi-Fi, but there's
Okay.
Xfinity Wi-Fi if you're a Comcast customer.
Man, you can tether my phone to that computer if you need.
Is it this? My phone?
No, I'm turning on my hotspot right now.
Oh, okay. I don't know what's up. Everything seems to have been like messed up.
Should we put the dog slide back on
Probably.
or turn on this?
I think the government like hacked me. Like,
Damn.
what the fuck? No, you can put it on Dropbox. This was I don't think it's going. It looks like even on Dropbox it was cut off. Yeah. So that's really weird and annoying. Hey, what the fuck? Are there earlier versions? Damn, yeah, I think I'm I actually have no idea what happened, but it looks like I'm out of luck. Okay, so I'll just like briefly go over them, then you guys can read it by yourselves if you want. Sorry again, it's weird. So basically the first one, finance with financiers, the main point that I wanted to draw from it was that a typical model of understanding finance and the duties of finance is that they match accumulated sums of capital to entities that can spend that capital profitably. So they're an intermediary between spenders and or savers and productive forces in society. However, we know that's not necessarily true. You know, credit exists, fractional reserving exists, and so that model is kind of bunk.
Can you talk about fractional reserving for a second?
Yeah, it's just the idea that you don't need to, with credit, if you're authorized to give credit as spendable money, then you don't need to have as much money as you're like essentially loaning out as credit. So you only say 20% of money in the bank is what you need to keep, whereas you give someone that other 80% different either other financial institutions or productive entities as credit, which is spendable, you know, basically as currency.
So you can loan out 5 times more money than you actually have.
Exactly. If you're authorized to.
Yes.
I see. So then that's the point that this man, Robert Hockett, was trying to make, is that the idea of authorization and spendable credit points to an ineliminable role of the state, the sovereign state, as an actor within the finance system. And so he wants to move from I forget what he calls it, but a matching of capital accumulation to productive forces model into what he calls a franchisee model. Basically, a franchise is one of these private institutions, a bank that is authorized by our central authority of the government to give out credit based on a public resource, which is basically the goodwill and credit of the state itself. So when private banks are giving out credit, what's up? Okay. Yeah. So when private banks are giving out credit, they're doing so, as we discussed earlier, based on the assumption that the U.S. government has their back. And so he calls this a franchisee model, kind of in the same way that, you know, like a McDonald's franchise exists. Is that this private owner who has the rights to, you know, the McDonald's brand and all of their IP and whatever, but ultimately they manage on behalf of McDonald's, or not, they own their own stuff, but they like use the rights to McDonald's, which is kind of bought from them. But so a private bank is kind of similar as a franchisee from a central bank, a central authority being the U.S. government. So basically, there is an ineliminable role of the public in supporting finance. Right? We saw with the bailouts in 2009 is that we have the bank's backs. And so that's basically what I wanted to take away from the first one. And so then the second one uses that model and conclusion and draws a strategy of financial democratization as a transition to socialism democratically. So given that model, he posits that given the allocation of the rights to be a franchisee of the sovereign monetary central system could be extended to non-profit organizations. Right now, we only have for-profit banks under the logic of capitalism who are able to extend credit on behalf of productive enterprise. But he posits that if you could expand that, you could have like non-profit credit institutions that can include either in-house government banks, like say like an infrastructure bank that allows credit for spending on infrastructure, or it could be a decentralized, diffuse network of nonprofits that are allowed to extend credit on behalf of different sectors of the economy that are currently being underserved. If you look at things like green energy as well as energy-saving retrofits, medium and poor housing, infrastructure, social entrepreneurship, all these sectors are starved for credit in the profit-seeking financial markets. So he says, why not just allow, like an infrastructure bank again, or some nonprofit credits, whatever thing. And he posits that you could build that up over years to the point where we're shrinking the for-profit credit sector, and we have a fairly resilient nonprofit credit sector. And then we are growing the economy through this because we are spending things like infrastructure, housing, et cetera, that profit-seeking finance is not accommodating right now. And so he mentioned that one of the big reasons that socialist democracy approach to transition into socialism through democratic socialism is like capital strikes, like stuff we were talking before, is retrenchment from the capitalist class, is strikes, is flight, is bourgeois media, blaming government policy as opposed to a conscious class class war essentially that ultimately starves the economy, slows down the economy, and undermines leftist governments. Well, if we had this entire nonprofit credit sector, perhaps that would be resilient to capitalist sabotage and profit-making sabotage. So, if we had a infrastructure bank with a good record for management and for allocating and receiving funds, if Goldman Sachs decided not to invest anymore, that bank would still be able to borrow on international markets because it still has a good record. And that bank would still be able to invest within the US economy, thereby maybe mitigating the effects of capital strike, capital flight, et cetera. And if that were the case, then you could pretty consciously point, from a political perspective, you could pretty consciously point to capitalist flight as being class warfare. You could say, look, these guys are trying to sabotage the economy, they're trying to pull the rug out from under you, but we do have these sectors run on non-for-profit finance that are allowing our economy to keep going on, we still have jobs, to some extent, et cetera, et cetera. At which point you have a pretty clear example of neoclassical economics as being, wrong. And the ability to wage pretty, say progressive taxation or to restructure business as a whole into say workers' co-ops or some other kind of collective mechanisms, because you have you have a somewhat functioning economy based on this public nonprofit finance sector, and B, you have a good case to be made that, look, these guys are trying to screw us, like, let's take it to them. So that's basically the strategic elements that the franchisee, that this guy, Fred Block, builds off of the franchisee model established by Robert Hockett. And he believes that there is political and economic avenues to achieving something like socialist transformation through that strategy. So if you want to actually like see it elaborated well, just read the papers, but that's my like pretty layman explanation of those papers. Sorry, that's for some reason those slides were not saved. So that's it.
That's it?
Good.
So I'm gonna
Thanks for
I'm gonna stop